Well, good morning once again. Good to see all of you. Dan, have we ever sung that song before? That's a good song. We should sing it more often.
We do.
All right. I should pay attention more often. And not to confess all the things that my wife says to me on a regular basis, right? So I should pay attention more often. Well, again, welcome. We're glad you're here. I'm excited to jumping into this little passage that we're going to be talking about from the book of Ruth. We are doing a series this summer that is on the beautiful, tenacious, loyal love of God. And in doing so, we're looking at three characters, three books, three main characters. We're looking at Ruth, and that's the one we're in the middle of right now. In a few weeks, we're going to start looking at Ezra. And then as we head into the fall and those later summer months, we're going to be looking at Esther. So we're in the midst of Ruth right now. And we started a couple weeks ago, just week one, looking at how Ruth's love parallels God's love. That God's love was not abandoned. And then we spent a couple of weeks looking at Naomi and how she went from being bitter, or from being pleasant to bitter, and how God responded to her through Ruth. And then, so we're going to take the next couple of weeks, and we're going to look at the character of Boaz in the story of Ruth. And so this week, we are going to look at just his role of the Kinsman redeemer, which is something that is brought out in the book, and just how that affects our life, and how his role of Kinsman redeemer in some ways reflects and points to Jesus. And then next week, Pastor Greg is going to be looking at just the man in Boaz and his character traits, which is going to be a really good thing for a good Father's Day sermon. So, like I said, I'm looking forward to today. So why don't you pray with me, and then we're going to jump in. Jesus, we thank you. Just as we sang. Thank you that you brought us who were once far off from you. Who, because of our sin, were your enemies. And you brought us to sit at your table. And you saved us through your Son. And I'm not sure we do often think about that reality. Even those of us who know and have followed after you for many years often forget or take for granted or just don't dwell on the reality that you loved us and saved us by your great grace. And so we thank you. And so, God, I pray today that as we look into your word, as we look at the character of Boaz and the role that he played in the story of Ruth, that we would see you. And that maybe if we just need a reminder of what you did for us, God, I pray that will be true too. So, God, teach us through your word. And may the words that I speak be your words. There are lots of thoughts and lots of things muddling around in my brain. And certainly some things are just not worth remembering. So God, may we take away what you want us to hear today. In Jesus' name. Amen. So if you have your Bible, open up to the book of Ruth, and we're going to be doing a little summary of that as we go in a second. But as we start here, let me ask you a question. So, and I don't have a clicker today, so I'm going to keep pointing to the back every once in a while. So first question I have for you, and I guess it's kind of geared mostly toward married couples here, but I don't know if any of you have ever had this playful conversation with your spouse, and hopefully sometimes early on in your marriage, when you've asked this question: honey, if you were to die, God forbid, but if you were to die, should I remarry? Have any of you asked this question or had this conversation? A couple brave people raise your hands. It's not a good question. It's not a good conversation to have. But I'm pretty sure Emily and I have had this conversation many times. I don't know what we're thinking because it never goes well. Never goes well because the answer that she gives is probably not the one that I'm expecting at that time, right? Because she's never going to tell me the person that I think I deserve. All right, whatever that means. But, sometimes that conversation even goes in a different way where they initiate the conversation. Like, honey, when I die, and it's going to be a long time from now, but, just when I die, I want you to marry, my best friend Sue. Okay. Actual conversation. I'm like, what? What? Excuse me? Who do you want me to marry? Why? And because I'm thinking, Sue, I thought you were going to say somebody like, Gal Gadot or something, Wonder Woman, or, that's who you want. And it's like, no, well, she's a really good woman, and, she would really do a good job taking care of the kids, which I know you're going to need help with. And obviously you can't cook, so we're going to need somebody who, and so she's like answering this question in a way of like really looking out for me. I'm like, wow, that's really thoughtful. Because if I were to tell you, when I die, I want you to marry, some ogre kind of person. I don't want somebody mean, but I just want you to remember that I was probably the best person that was ever going to come into your life. Right? So, it's, like I said, it's not a good conversation to have. And I'm sure at some point we're going to have it again. It's just what happens. So, yeah, it's, because in my house, really, what is when I die, Emily is allowed to marry a young version of Nicolas Cage, and when she dies, I'm allowed to marry Princess Grace Kelly, because in this hypothetical situation, you're actually allowed to marry anybody from any era, and so it doesn't really matter, right? Because it's hypothetical. So, but you know what has never come into this conversation? We have never said, when I die, I want you to marry my younger brother. I want you to marry my brother Matt. Because, frankly, both of us would go ew, gross, because I'm obviously the better brother. So, if she would have wanted to marry him, she would have picked him at the beginning, right? So, but yeah, that's just kind of, and frankly, all family members, as far as I'm concerned, was off limits. And she would totally agree. She knows my family, and that's just not going to be an option. But what we're going to look at today, out of the story of Ruth, is see how this sort of family intervention was used to provide and to protect Ruth and Naomi. So, kind of a roundabout way of getting us to that point, right? Okay, so if you want to go ahead to that just next slide. So, but before we actually go and dig into this concept of Boaz as the kinsman redeemer, let's go back and just do a quick review of the story. So the book of Ruth happens, it says right there in the very first verse, this happens in the time of the judges. So it's after the Canaan conquest here in the Old Testament. So they've gone through the 40 years of wandering. They've come into the promised land, and they've had these wars and these battles, and now the Israelites are in the promised land. So the conquest is over, and now there's this time and this period of judges. And so if you read the book of Judges, there's lots of other invasions and battles going on, and there's lots of sin and other things. But this story that's happening in the midst of that, kind of in parallel with the book of Judges, is this very beautiful and very calm story in the midst of those, tumultuous times here. And the book of Ruth deals more with real life in ancient Israel and not necessarily with the warfare and other things from the previous book. And so the time of Judges, that's basically like 1360 BC until about 1030 or so BC. The author of the book is not told to us, but it's probably Samuel's rabbinic tradition in Israel says it was probably Samuel who wrote this book. And he's writing it in the time of King David. And we know this because at the end, it kind of lists this genealogy that ends with David. So at least this happened, is being written after about 1000 or the late 900s BC. And the book traces the messianic line of King David back to Ruth, who was a Moabitess. So she's a foreigner. And the book gives us a beautiful understanding of how God rewards faithfulness and devotion. Now, on the next slide, just a little picture of the promised land there. I hope you can see that clearly. But if I were to summarize each chapter here, basically it's like, due to a famine in the land of Judah, this man named Elimelech, who's a native of the town of Bethlehem there in Judah, he emigrates to Moab, foreign country, with his wife and 2 sons. They married 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. Not Oprah, although this is where Oprah kind of got her name. That's, just a freebie on her side. But Ruth and Orpah are these Moabitess women that the 2 sons marry. And after about 10 years, all 3 women, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, find themselves widows. And so they find out that the famine has ended, and they head back to Bethlehem. Not all 3 of them, though, because, Naomi tries to tell her daughters-in-law to stay in their country. Orpah agrees. Ruth says, no, I'm not going. Where you go, I will go. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. That beautiful show of love and devotion that Ruth has for Naomi in there. They arrive in Bethlehem at the time of the barley harvest. So April, May time of year. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is when Ruth goes out and she starts gleaning in the fields. So she realizes that they're impoverished, they need to get some food, and so she goes out as a way, as sort of the younger person, to go into the fields and collect some food. And she ends up gleaning in the fields of this man named Boaz, who we find out is a family member of Elimelech, Naomi's former husband there. And we see that Boaz is a person who, because of his relationship with his servants and the way that he treats them, is a man of great character. And he's heard of Ruth's kindness toward Naomi, and he treats her favorably, and allowing and providing for her and offering protection for Ruth as well. And then in chapter 3, Naomi and Ruth sort of enact this plan to propose marriage between Ruth and Boaz. And because of Hebrew law, Ruth had the right to kind of expect or demand that a near relative of her late husband would take her as his wife. And Boaz, who, as we said, is related to this family, is willing to marry her, but since there's another person who's a little more closely related, he has to go through this process of eliminating this other person, not killing him, all right, not going that far, but kind making sure that that other person's not interested, and he goes through the process and all the legal measures in order to rightfully redeem the land and those women, those widowed women. So that's chapter 3, and then in chapter 4, Boaz meets up with the leaders of the city, and the person who's a closer relative, and after laying the situation out, the other relative passes on his duties here. And so Boaz willingly steps in as the role of kinsman redeemer here. And so this being done, to get married with the blessing of all their neighbors, and eventually Ruth and Boaz become the parents of Obed, who is the father of Jesse, who is the father of David, the great king of Israel. So that's the Reader's Digest version here of the book of Ruth. So like I said, we're going to take a look at Boaz here and basically see who he is and really how he's significant to this story. So here on the next slide, so Boaz, the kinsman redeemer. So what we know of him, he's introduced here in chapter 2, that he is of the clan of Elimelech. He's a relative. Now, it doesn't say here in this passage precisely what his relationship is. The rabbinic tradition says that Boaz's father, Salmon, was the brother of Elimelech, which would make Boaz a nephew. I don't know if that's necessarily true, and frankly, it's not all that relevant to the story. But he is a relationship here. More than likely, though, he's probably someone from the same generation as Elimelech, because of just the references throughout the passage where he's referring to Ruth as my daughter, and just showing that sign of respect and the age differences in there. So he's implying in that he's older. And then it also says that what we know of Boaz from chapter 2 is that he is said that he is one of our redeemers. And after Ruth comes back into the fields and she's telling Naomi of what she was doing and where she was gleaning and where she was getting this grain and this barley from, Naomi's like, oh, that's great. That's a great place for you to be, because Boaz, not just a relationship, he's one of our redeemers. And probably for most of us in this culture, we would hear that and not really know what to think of that, because that's not really something that we think about in terms of our relatives. Oh, our relative is a redeemer? I don't know. What, do you use a lot of coupons or something? I don't know. So we're going to look at that. Like, what does it mean by saying that Boaz is a redeemer? So here on the next slide says that a kinsman redeemer, he's the relative who restores or preserves the full community rights of disadvantaged family members. His purpose is to protect the family and the land. And really, this concept arises from God's covenant relationship with Israel. So he's a family member. He had to be qualified. He had to be a relative. A redeemer was somebody who was a part of the family. He had to be able, so he had to be qualified. He had to be able. So he had to be able to pay the price necessary to buy back or to redeem land that had been lost, or to redeem the person who might have been in servitude or bondage or slavery or whatever. But he had to be able to do it. And then he also had to be willing. A qualified redeemer actually could say no to it. He could bypass his responsibilities. And in doing so, in that culture and according to the laws, they would be shamed for doing it. But they could refuse. So And so let's look at the duties of what this kinsman redeemer had. So the first one is that duty was to redeem the land. And you'll find the passages about what the duties of a kinsman redeemer was in some of those books of the Bible that we tend to skip over pretty quickly because they're a little more difficult to read. Leviticus and Deuteronomy and things like that are just full of laws and customs and things that we don't fully comprehend because they're not part of our culture and a part of our way of doing things. But in the book of Leviticus, in chapter 25, it talks about redeeming the land. And I'm going to turn and read that just for a second here in Leviticus 25, verses 25 through 28. If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. If a man has no one to redeem it, and then himself becomes prosperous and finds sufficient means to redeem it, let him calculate the year since he sold it and pay back the balance to the man to whom he sold it, and then return to his property. So if somebody has become destitute and they have this piece of property, they could sell it. But the idea of property in ancient Israel is that really nobody owned the property. The property, the land, all was God's. It all belonged to God. And God had given it to his people, the promised land, for them to live in and to take care of. But it was all God. It's all part of that theocracy. But if somebody who was responsible for part of that land fell into hard times, they could take what was given to them and they could sell it. Pass over ownership to somebody else. And that is a way of them being able to get some money and to be able to live. But God had given it to this tribe, this land to this tribe, to these people. And so there could be a family member who would come in and say, you know what? We're going to step in so that this land retains as a part of our tribe, as a part of our family, and I'm going to buy that back. Keep it in the family, and so that it doesn't have to go over and transfer over to somebody else. And so one of the duties of the kinsman redeemer is to redeem the land. And we'll see how that plays out here in the book of Ruth in chapter 4. But another thing that the kinsman redeemer does is that they redeem the enslaved. So later on here in Leviticus 25, and I don't know why I closed that passage, but verses 47 through 55, and I'm not going to read it all. But if a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor, and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you, or to a member of that stranger's clan, then after he is sold, he may be redeemed. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle, or his cousin may redeem him, or a close relative from his clan may redeem him. Or if he grows rich, he may redeem himself. And it's just this idea, just like with the land, that if somebody falls into hard times, and they sell themselves as a servant to pay off debts or to make sure that they're taken care of so they have a place to live and to work and to eat. And if they do that to somebody who is a foreigner who comes in from the outside, then a family member has that right and that responsibility really to come in and to buy that person back so that they are not left in servitude to this outsider. So another thing. So the kinsman redeemer, they redeem the land. They redeem the enslaved. And the third thing is they serve as a trustee. So if something happens and restitution needs to be paid to the family, then this redeemer kind of comes in, and he's the one who handles and takes and collects the money on behalf of the family member in which restitution is deserved. The fourth thing is that they serve as avenger of blood. So he's not, Captain Marvel or Iron Man or something like that. It's not that kind of avenger. But in this culture, in this society where we are talking about an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, where something happens and somebody is killed or murdered and there needs to be justice that is played out, that the kinsman redeemer is the one who, when someone is sentenced for that, is that it is their role to carry out that sentence. So, if my brother is killed and murdered by someone else, and that murderer is found to be guilty, then it is the role of me as the kinsman redeemer to be the one to carry out that sentence. Now, that's a pretty heavy responsibility. I don't know if any of us would be the one who would say, I don't know, maybe some of us in anger or some righteous justice think, yeah, I'd be willing to flip the switch on someone if that happened to my family. But that's a pretty heavy and weighty duty that a family member might have in terms of being a redeemer for your family, is that I have to be the one to carry out that sentence. So that's the fourth thing. They redeem the land. They redeem the enslaved. They serve as a trustee, so to speak. They serve as the avenger of blood. And then the fifth thing that a kinsman redeemer, the duty of a kinsman redeemer is to provide an heir. So and that's in the case of when a man dies and he has no children. And it's kind of one of those things, kind of like, I was saying with my brother and my wife, that's kind of an ooh thing for us to think about that so if I were to have died without any male heirs, it would have been my brother's responsibility to marry my wife. All right, everybody say ooh right now. And then it would have been his job to help provide her a male heir. And in doing so, it's not his kid, it's my kid. Even though I'm gone, that kinsman redeemer is there to carry on the name of my family and my clan. And again, this is in a society where those types of inheritance laws and then types of family leadership things are in place to protect and to provide for the entire clan. So the kinsman redeemer kind of steps in and not providing an heir for himself, but in marrying my widow would be providing an heir for me. Again, a concept that's a little foreign to most of us. But this concept, as it says on the next slide, is this idea of levirate marriage. And it comes from this Latin word, and I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, so lever, and it just meaning the husband's brother. It's a type of marriage where the husband's brother kind of steps in and marries the widow so that he can provide an heir for the family. And it's not just something that happened in Israel. It was very common in ancient Near East cultures. It happened all around the ancient Near East cultures. And it even preceded the time in which this was codified in the Jewish law, because that happened with back in Genesis with Judah and Tamar, and then there are other extra biblical stories that talk about this levirate marriage kind of coming in. So it was a very common thing to happen in this culture. Yet it did become codified in part of the Jewish law as how they were supposed to live. And this was part of God's covenant with them to provide and to protect them as they dwelled in the promised land. So, all right, so let's look a little bit just closer at the story here of Boaz here. So if you turn to Ruth now, and we're going to look at chapter 3, and we're going to start in verse 4. And this is the marriage proposal here. And again, so as I told you in the and you may remember, but as I told you in the Reader's Digest version, so this is this plan that Naomi and Ruth kind of come up with of how she is going to approach Boaz in order to get him to agree to marry her, to marry Ruth, and take part in his place and his role of the kinsman redeemer. So he says, but when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she, Ruth, replied, all that you say I will do. And so Ruth went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then Ruth came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. In midnight, the man was startled and turned over. And behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, who are you? She said, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good. Let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. All right, I got to admit, that's just kind of a little weird story, right? Right? Kind of going, laying down next to him, uncovering his feet, startling a guy in the middle of the night. Like, that's just weird. It's kind of full of customs and phrases and things that don't resonate with us in our modern Western way of doing things. But you know what? It's actually a very innocent picture here. And some people have looked at this and interpreted it in a way to imply that something improper or sexual happened in this, where Ruth was coming in to seduce Boaz or to trick him into marrying her. But I really believe those who look at it this way are imposing their 21st century cultural conditioning on sexual permissiveness into this story, which just isn't there. Both Ruth and Boaz have shown themselves to be people of integrity and honor. And so obviously, if we were to read something improper into this, that's negating everything that we know about these characters already. And we know that biblical writers are not shy about describing some of these more intimate R-rated stories. You think about Lot and his daughters, or you think about Judah and his daughter-in-law, or you think about David, or any number of stories in there. Biblical writers do not shy away from kind of the messy stuff. And several commentators have noted that Boaz, being older by a generation, would not approach Ruth, a younger person. He did show tremendous kindness toward her, but he would not have initiated a proposal. So this is a way that a woman could gracefully initiate a proposal to a man. Strange and unique to us, but a gracious way to gracefully initiate it. And then certainly in the middle of night, if he were to reject it, she can kind of walk away and everybody is intact and nobody needs to be publicly embarrassed by this. So, it really is this innocent, gracious way of Ruth initiating this marriage proposal. And where we know that it is just that, is this comment there where she says there in verse 9, spread your wings over your servant, or spread the corner of your garment over me. She's saying, protect me, marry me. You know, in some ways, even the writer is reflecting back to chapter 2, verse 12, where Boaz commends Ruth for coming back and says that you have put yourself under the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge here. So she is saying, spread your wings over me, put your garment over me, and marry me. And Boaz says, you have made this kindness greater than the first. Now, Boaz isn't saying, as an older man, you know, gosh, how sweet of you as a young girl to kind of want to come marry me, an older guy. You know, maybe there's a part of that in there, but that's not really what he's getting at, is, wow, your kindness toward me, of you being this, you know, cute young thing, being interested in me, this older guy, what he's talking about is Ruth's kindness toward Naomi, which is first mentioned there in chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. Was that her loyal love and devotion to stay with Naomi and travel back from Moab to Bethlehem was something that was well noted and well observed and respected by other people. And this kindness that she's showing is not just that she's choosing him over younger men, some of whom may have been wealthier and maybe better looking or in the prime of their manhood, where, you know, if she really wanted to have a family, she could have gone there, and she could have gone and seeking protection there. But Boaz is rightly observing that this kindness that Ruth is showing is that she's putting aside those things where she could have her own family and her own descendants, and coming to Boaz and showing this kindness toward Naomi and saying, be the kinsman redeemer so that Naomi and Elimelech can have an heir. Come and marry me, not for my sake, not even just for our sake. And it's clear, it seems very clear in this passage, that the two have grown to love each other in some way. But the kindness in this is being shown to Naomi. Is that I want you to be my redeemer so that my mother-in-law, my widowed mother-in-law, and my deceased father-in-law can have an heir. Redeem our family. And it doesn't go past the observation of Boaz that is a great kindness being shown, where she's overlooking her own needs and her own potential for family and putting it back onto the family itself, the broader family. Because as we said in this idea of the levirate marriage, that any heir or son that would be born to her would not be considered hers, but it would be considered an heir of Elimelech and Naomi. And you see that in Boaz's motivation for doing this in chapter 4, verse 5, when he's actually meeting with the townspeople. He says, the day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Is that when they marry, he's recognizing that what's going to happen here is not just a union between them, but in order that the family of Elimelech, the family of the dead man, would have perpetuate his name as an inheritance. So Boaz says, yes, I'm going to do it. He goes, but there is one other person. I'm willing to do it. So he's qualified. He's a family member. He's willing to do it, but there's somebody else who is a little bit more qualified. So there's somebody who has this first right of refusal. And so that's where this whole redemption transaction takes place. So on the next slide, looking at Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 through 12. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." It was pretty convenient that he came. He's like, "All right, grabbed him, sit down. I got something for you." So the guy turned aside and sat down. And then he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there's no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And the other guy said, "I will redeem it." So it's this nice little, I don't know, maybe it's almost, as you're reading the story, you're kind of becoming, fans of Ruth and Boaz. You're excited. You're ready for them to get together. And then all of a sudden there's this little twist of, hey, wait a second, there's one other person that can do it. So I'm going to, give him that first right of refusal. So Boaz gives him that option. And the guy says, "Yeah, you know what? I'm going to do it." And as you're reading that, as a reader, you're like, "Oh, wait a second. We don't want him to say yes. We want Ruth and Boaz to get together." I mean, it's like a really good Hollywood movie here. You're rooting for these main people. But then there's a nice little twist here. Boaz kind of drops the rest of the story on it. So verse 5 says, "Then Boaz says, 'The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance.' Then the Redeemer said, 'I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it.'" So, we're excited. Like, oh wait, this guy, he's like, "Wait a second, I was excited about the land, but I don't want the girl too. Like, forget that. So I'm going to pass. Thanks, but no thanks. That's just too rich for my blood." And so, as a reader, you're like, "Yeah, you're excited." It opens the door. Now Ruth and Boaz can get together here. And so then the next couple of verses, they have this whole little shoe thing. Again, that's one of those weird things that we don't really get. I don't know how a shoe and a sandal has something to do with a legal transaction there. I won't go into the various different theories of why that really worked in their culture. But they do this whole shoe thing to show that the transaction is going to become legally binding, where Boaz can redeem the land. He's going to be able to buy this small little bit of land that Naomi had, so he could redeem it for the family, and also be able to marry Ruth. So Boaz, he marries Ruth, a penniless foreigner. He redeems her and Naomi, two people who really had nothing to offer him. And he does it for the sake of the inheritance of his family member. And he does it so that he could provide protection to them and offer them a hope and a future as well. And the good news from it is that he is able to help provide an heir. They had a son, ensuring that the family line of Elimelech will continue on. And it's interesting because it does say in chapter 4, verse 17, that the son was born to Naomi. I know how it was when we had our first kid, and my mom was really excited about finally, that we had a boy here. And I was thinking, wait a second, this isn't your kid, this is my kid. Yeah. I don't know why you're acting like this is yours, but this is my kid here. But this child, this heir, is born, it's said, attributed to Naomi. It's also weird that the whole rest of the town gets to help pick the name for the kid here, but, that was never going to happen in my family, But the son that is born is Obed. His son was Jesse, and Obed's grandson was David, who grew to become the killer of Goliath, the king of Israel. King David, the writer of the Psalms. So, he successfully carries out his duties as the kinsman redeemer here. Now, the whole book of Ruth reads like the person who wrote it knew about Jesus. Even though this was written in 1000 or late 900s BC, it's like the person who wrote it knew about Jesus. And as we know that God is the author of all the Scriptures, so it makes perfect sense that the themes and of all that carry throughout the entire books of the Bible. What's really interesting, though, is that in the New Testament, the very first book, the very first chapter, Matthew 1, picks up where Ruth ends, with the genealogy of Jesus, but it includes Boaz and Obed and Jesse and David, and continues it all the way down to Jesus. And just like Boaz was the kinsman redeemer of Naomi and Ruth, Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. We, like Ruth, were foreigners to God. We, like Naomi, had at times rejected God and are bitter toward God. And certainly in our sin, we rebel against God. And certainly we, in many ways, by our action and by our sin, have sold ourselves to this world and the choices that we make and the things that we do, so that our relationship with God had been broken. And so we, like Ruth and Naomi, we need a Redeemer. And so Jesus, who eternally existed as the second person of the Trinity, entered this world, the Son of Man. Even though he was God, he became our relative. He took on flesh. And the Bible says that Jesus was not ashamed to be called our brother. And the Lord Jesus Christ bought us for himself out of the curse, out of our sin, out of our destitution. We had nothing to offer God. There are none of us that are righteous. No, not one. We could not and cannot redeem ourselves. But he redeemed us. He bought us for himself. He made us, just like Boaz made Ruth his bride. Jesus makes us his bride and blesses us for all generations. And when Jesus came, Hebrews 9:12 says, he bought our eternal redemption. And those who seek to know the true God are redeemed by the Lord Jesus Christ, who paid the price in full to make us his purchased possession, his eternal bride, to which he, for all eternity, pours out blessing. Just like we sang that once we were enemies, and now we've been redeemed and we can sit at the table. That's a huge thing. And I don't know if you have ever experienced the love of Jesus in a way that you recognize that what he did on the cross was to redeem us from from a debt that we could not pay. God loves us and created us to know him personally. Loves us. He created us to have a relationship with him. But because of our sin, we are separated from God. And there's nothing that we can do on our own to get to God. All the things that we have done, whether it's just a little small thing or whether we've committed the most heinous acts, are things that keep us from God. But it doesn't matter. But because through Jesus, he paid our debts. The wages of sin was death. And death we couldn't pay. So Jesus was qualified. But he was also able. He didn't owe this death penalty. So he could pay a death penalty on our behalf. And so he is God's only provision for our sin. And if we just can individually trust him to pay for that sin, accept him as our Redeemer, then that relationship with God can be restored. I said here, Ruth is this beautiful picture. This love story in the middle of the Old Testament that's in the midst of all this other chaos. But Jesus redeeming us is this love story that is intended for you and for me. And without accepting Jesus as our Redeemer, we have no hope. We have no protection. We have no future. So if you haven't trusted Christ as your Savior, I urge you to make today that day. We need Jesus. So pray with me. God, thank you for this story of Ruth and Boaz. That you have come to be our kinsman redeemer. And God, as we looked at this story, certainly there are things about it that don't fully resonate with us. God, I think it's true that even the fact that you died on the cross for us is not something that most of us can fully resonate with. How your sacrificial death cost you everything could somehow bring me into a right relationship with God? I don't get it. But God, I thank you for that. Thank you for dying on the cross for my sin. And Lord, I pray that each person here would be at a place where they know that they have trusted you as their Savior. So God, we love you and we praise you and we thank you in the name of your Son. Amen.